Welcome to Shellphone, the podcast that gives the ocean its very own hotline. Join us as we hear from ocean stewards, discover threats to ocean health, and learn ways we can all answer the ocean's call. This podcast is brought to you by Breach the Surface and Coastal Creative. I'm Harmony Dawson, and joining us this episode is Alanna Kieffer. Hey Alanna, thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, can you give us a little introduction to yourself and what you do?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. My name is Alanna Kieffer. I am a marine science educator and sustainable seafood educator on the Oregon coast. I host workshops around shellfish and seaweed foraging and coastal exploration and education, as well as work with seaweed as a seaweed farmer and getting more seaweed and local seafood into our culinary market.
You have a background in a lot of things, including just marine science in general, environmental education, seaweed farming, foraging. Before we get into talking about what you're working on currently, can you tell us a little bit about those different experiences and how your connection to the ocean first started?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny question for me because I don't really know where it started. I was born in New York City. I lived in Pennsylvania in the Pocono Mountains for a long time. And I don't know why I was fascinated with the ocean, but throughout my whole childhood wanted to learn more about the ocean. And I knew I wanted to study marine biology. And I moved to the Oregon coast in 2012, so about 12, 13 years ago, and moved directly to the Oregon coast where I got involved with rocky shore education. So was working in our intertidal ecosystems, teaching visitors about what they could find here. And that really sparked my love of education, but eventually went and got a formal degree in marine biology at Oregon State University, and then continued on the kind of communications and education path down in the Channel Islands. So was working on Catalina Island as a marine science educator there, mostly with kids, but taking them snorkeling through kelp and learning about California's marine ecosystems and doing a lot of kayaking and hiking and fish labs and all sorts of stuff. But then moved back up to Oregon in 2020 where that was when I started working with seaweed more.
Cool. I think I also read that you did some studying in Australia.
I did, yeah. So part of my undergrad with Oregon State, I went on a study abroad program to Australia and was living in Townsville studying at James Cook University. So I just did one semester there, but got to do some really cool field work and studies around coral ecology and marine debris around the islands in Australia.
I was just interested in that when I saw it because we had a past episode that was about all different kinds of seaweed, and the guest on that was based in Australia. So I saw the little connection there.
Yeah, I unfortunately, when I was there, was not as involved with seaweed work as I am now. But
another question I wanted to ask you about your background kind of in education is what your favorite part is about being an educator, especially in the outdoor or environmental field.
Yeah, I think that I mean, it starts with the fact that I'm a people person. So I love meeting new people and getting to just interact with new people all the time. But yeah, specifically educating people in these outdoor settings to me is like where the most valuable education happens. So I've never really worked. I mean, I occasionally like guest teach in classrooms, but it has never really been my interest to just be a teacher in like a formal education setting. And yeah, in my 10, 11 years of working in this field, just it never gets old, like being in the outdoors and actually immersing people in these ecosystems. And, I can go to the same place every day for 5 days in a row, but every one of those 5 days is completely different and there's new lessons to teach. And it's just such a dynamic ecosystem, especially here on the Oregon coast. It's pretty, just ever changing. And I think sharing that and getting to really dive into that with people when they're standing on the beach and seeing the things that we're learning about is just so valuable.
That's a good point, that there's always kind of something new to notice if you look at the smaller details or are just more mindful about it in general when you're out in nature, even if you think you know everything that's happening there already?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's like small changes day to day, but also, falling in love with the same place in every single season it's just so fun.
Yeah. I was going to ask this a little bit later on, but since it's kind of come up, I was curious what kind of changes you've noticed in the environment where you are over the time that you've been going out there, or patterns that you've seen depending on like season or weather or things like that.
Yeah, so weather-wise and just season-wise, the Oregon coast is pretty we have crazy winters compared to our summers. In the summer, it's, generally pretty calm and not as hot as Florida maybe, but gets, up into the 70s. In the winter, we get some pretty crazy storms. So we get a ton of rain and it's often pretty just gray and stormy outside. This year we had like 40-foot swell hitting our coastline. So definitely a different dynamic and not really a time that I'm out on the beach exploring as much. And yeah, in my time being here and being immersed in these ecosystems, we have seen a lot of changes. I happened to move here just a couple years before a huge die-off of sea stars happened. So our rocky intertidal habitats have a lot of Pisaster sea stars, and the whole West Coast was affected by the sea star wasting disease, which hit in 2014, and it wiped out about 90% of the starfish along the entire West Coast. And it really took like about a month. I was working in the rocky ecosystems, and over the course of 1 month, we went from having like thousands of starfish on our rocks to almost none. It happened incredibly quickly. Nobody really knew what exactly was going on. They knew it was a virus that was affecting sea stars. And Oregon State University and a lot of other universities immediately started doing research to figure out what was happening. And it's still kind of this anomaly. They have like some reasonings as to why it happened, but sea stars are considered a keystone species on the Oregon coast. And that's because of their effect on our intertidal ecosystems as a whole. And so there was a lot of worry that we would lose the diversity within our intertidal. They're some of the most diverse and abundant ecosystems that we have. And, thinking, oh, if we lose the starfish and the mussels start to overtake, it would just completely change that area. So that being said, it's like 10 years later now, which is crazy. And we haven't seen that drastic. It would take a long time for that to happen, as well as it's taking a long time for the sea stars to come back. But we have seen a big increase in the amount of sea stars that have returned to these ecosystems. So yeah, that's just one big change, but it was a pretty drastic change. And there's a lot going on in our ecosystems right now with, warming water temperatures and the loss of bulk kelp and definitely some other ones.
What are some of the other plants and animals that you find on the Oregon coast, in the intertidal zone specifically, or just in general? And what's kind of the, I guess, geological makeup of the coast? You said it was a rocky.
Yeah, we have a lot. Our shores are super, super rocky. It's a lot of basalt, so a lot of volcanic activity that has kind of shaped our whole coastline. And it creates these spaces that allow a lot of animals to recruit and find homes in, right? So as opposed to just one open sandy beach, all of these different rocks allow for space for different animals to inhabit. And because we have pretty large tide swings on the Oregon coast, so it is about a 10-foot tide change from the highest and the lowest tides. And that tide is moving twice a day. Well, it's moving all the time, but we have 2 high and 2 low tides every day. And so within that 10-foot span of the intertidal, it's a huge amount of space that makes up our intertidal. So the word intertidal just meaning the area between the highest and the lowest tides. And that's kind of the area that I specialize in, or that I spend most of my time in. We don't have the most, crystal clear tropical waters, but that's because our waters are full of nutrients and they're full of life that's fueling everything else on our shores. So the Oregon intertidal ecosystems are incredibly diverse and incredibly abundant, both with animals and with algae. So the Pacific Northwest is home to more kelp diversity than anywhere else on Earth, which is pretty cool. Kelps really need cold waters and nutrient-rich waters, which are two things that we have. And there's a ton of animal life. So the sea stars are the big ones that everybody talks about because they're colorful and they're big and they're easy to find. But we have a lot of sea anemones and tiny little nudibranchs and sea slugs and snails and literally, yeah, it's like overwhelming how much stuff we have on our rocky shores. So yeah, it's an ever-changing ecosystem, but there is primary things that you see when you're there. And then most of our coastline has been made up of bull kelp forests, and those are a little bit more subtidal, so not in the space between the tides, but the bull kelp forests are another very important part of our ecosystems.
Awesome. I was doing some thinking about tidal variation when I was planning for this episode, because I grew up in Maine, and so I was always hearing that Maine has the highest tidal variation. And then after moving here to Florida, the Gulf of Mexico has a much, much smaller tidal variation. So I went from 6 meters in Maine of variation to closer to 1 meter here on the Gulf of Mexico. So that was a super interesting change. I was super used to having those big tides growing up and going to the coast that I didn't realize quite so much that wasn't the case everywhere. And then the coast of Oregon kind of sits somewhere in between those two variations.
Yeah, it's funny. I've had that experience when I was down on Catalina Island. We would do low tide things with kids, and it was always like, there's not a lot of tide swing going on here. And for our tide pooling and our exploring, it's really amazing, but that's also what makes our coastline semi-dangerous with different ocean currents and rip currents that form. A lot of it can be attributed back to the tides.
So another thing that I'm curious about is if there are any invasive species there that have had a big impact on the intertidal zone specifically.
Yeah, there's like one species that I've been seeing more that I've heard is invasive. I don't think it's considered like a huge problem at this point, but it's a type of tunicate that is an encrusting species. It's a clonal encrusting species. So it just grows over other things. I don't see it so much, but it's the one that comes to mind. In terms of other species that are starting to take over, yeah, I mentioned the loss of the sea stars and the worry about the mussels, which are native, so they're not an invasive species, but it's definitely something where we have lost a lot of species in our coastal ecosystems recently, and so it's causing kind of this like imbalance of other things. And a huge example of that is mostly subtidal, so not intertidal, but is with our bull kelp, where we've wiped out sea otters in Oregon. Back in the 1800s, they were wiped out to extinction on the Oregon coast. We don't have any sea otters, which is unique compared to California and Washington, who have both gotten their sea otters back. And then with the sea star wasting disease that I mentioned, we lost the largest sea star was the sunflower sea star. They have about 20 arms. They were very fast and considered ferocious predators. And both of those, the sea otters and the sunflower sea stars, were predators of purple sea urchins. And since we've lost the two predators, our urchin populations have skyrocketed in recent years. And the main food source of purple urchins is kelp. On our coast, it's the bull kelp. And so over the past 10 years, there's surveys that just came out about this, but we've lost about 70% of our bull kelp forests on the Oregon coast, which is a shocking number and is a little bit scary when you really dive into how much kelp forests do to our ecosystems and to our fisheries as a whole. We rely on kelp forests, whether we know it or not. But yeah, this urchin and kelp dynamic has definitely been big talk in recent years and is definitely something a lot of people are focusing on.
You mentioned a little bit ago about something being a keystone species. And I was reminded of that when you were talking about urchins as well. Can you just give a quick description of what that means?
Definitely. Yeah. So a keystone species, we have a number of different keystone species, but a keystone species is essentially a species that is maybe not as abundant as other species, but it has a higher impact on its ecosystem. So how I learned about a keystone species is thinking about like a rock arch, right? And that rock that's in the center of the arch is the keystone. And there's only one of the rocks in the center compared to the maybe 5 on either side. But if you take out the one in the center, the whole thing collapses, right? So you can think of that as an ecosystem. You have, in our rocky intertidal habitats, it's a sea star, and there might not be as many sea stars as there are barnacles covering everything, but you can remove a couple barnacles and it's not really an issue. Whereas if you remove a lot of the sea stars, they have a bigger impact on the whole ecosystem, mainly because of what they're eating. So yeah, a keystone species is a very important species that you don't want to lose in an ecosystem. And a sea otter is also considered a keystone species. So we've lost 2 very important keystone species on our coast.
Thank you for explaining that. Okay, so I think now we can move into talking about your big project, which is Shifting Tides. So you offer a variety of different workshops intended to help people connect with their environments and also their like coastal food systems. And that can include topics like tide pooling, mussel and seaweed foraging, clamming, crabbing, things like that. When did you start doing this and how has it kind of grown or evolved over time?
Yeah, Shifting Tides started formally 2 years ago. I started my own business of doing this. And I've worked in marine science education here for a long time. So it had been kind of percolating and developing for a lot longer before that. But yeah, I launched it in February 2 years ago, and it has just given me a platform and a place where I can kind of shape and design workshops however I want and with friends that I want to work with. So it almost felt like an excuse to just work with people that I love and doing all sorts of different stuff on our coastline, but also getting the general public involved in learning about different topics and really being involved in some of the conservation work that's going on. So I host, coastal foraging workshops around shellfish and seaweeds, and then just general exploration and education workshops where we go tide pooling. And the connection to food to me has been really important in recent years, and that is kind of where the foraging came into play. But I have been working a lot with seaweed and in food systems on the Oregon coast, and I grew up in a family of chefs. So both my parents were restaurant owners and cookbook editors, and my brother went down that track and he's a chef. And I think for a long time, I kind of escaped the world of food on purpose and did something completely different. But we have a big impact on our ecosystems around the decisions that we make around food. So I think it's just a really important topic to me, and connecting people to this place, especially the Oregon coast, where we rely so heavily, everywhere relies so heavily on their environment for food. But connecting people to this place through food was just a way to get people to have a much deeper understanding of how much we rely on these ecosystems.
What kind of people or what kind of motivations do you see from people who participate in your workshops?
It's a good question. It's a huge range of people. Kind of my first question when I started this was, how are people going to hear about these, or who's going to come out to the coast? And in Oregon, we don't really have big cities on the coast. So I live, in a tiny town of 300 people, and most of our population is inland. Portland is about an hour and a half away from me. So obviously we get a lot of tourists and vacationers, but it's not really something that I necessarily can only advertise in my local area. And I've been really lucky that there's been, a lot of like media that has latched on and been excited about these new opportunities. And it spreads my workshops kind of throughout the Portland and city areas. And I work with a huge range of people. A lot of times I get kids who come to the tide pooling workshops with their parents. I've done a couple things now with schools and homeschool groups to specifically take students out. Yeah, I get people of all ages, really, from like 5 years old to probably 75 years old. And, some things are a lot of the foraging we do, we're on kind of slippery, rocky terrain. So it kind of limits, which I'm aware of, and I'm trying to find ways to educate outside of that. But yeah, a huge, huge range of people. During the start of the pandemic, I guess it was 2022 that I really started this, but I had a lot of people who mentioned specifically wanting to learn where their food was coming from and how to forage food kind of out of this scarcity and fear mindset, which was a little bit surprising to me. But, in that time we had grocery store shelves that were empty because food couldn't get out to the coast. So it was kind of people were just realizing that they didn't have any connection to where food was coming from. And yeah, that has kind of shifted now into, I think foraging just had a huge boom in that time frame, and people are wanting to learn more and more about how to find food from the land. So it's been a huge range, and it's gotten a kind of a larger range as we've developed other workshops, but we started doing art-focused workshops that aren't really out in the field, but they're coming together to make seaweed art, and so you can learn still about seaweed and the coastal ecosystem, but through a different lens. And that has, diversified the groups that we've gotten out on the coast.
Yeah, it makes sense that such a wide range of people are interested in different parts of what you do. If I was a kid, I would love to go tide pooling and find all the cool little critters in there. You mentioned a few topics that I do want to talk about, but a smaller one first. I'd love to talk just about tide pools in general because they give such an interesting and kind of more accessible look into marine life. And I'd love to hear more about the species and the species interactions and different like adaptations that you see in these habitats. Because obviously it's not an easy life living somewhere where you're so exposed and only have like a little bit of water. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's all of what you just said is like why tide pools in the intertidal is so fascinating to me. But again, on the Oregon coast, we have, these rocky shores that make up our beaches, and the intertidal ecosystems and rocky shores, I think, account for like 1% of the total landmass on Earth is considered intertidal. 41% of Oregon's coastline is rocky intertidal. So a lot of our coast is ecosystems like this that you can explore, which is pretty unique to the Oregon coast. And yeah, the animals that live in the intertidal they have to adapt to not having water, not having their like life force for multiple hours twice a day, right? And here in Oregon, where we do have two low tides every day, but they're completely different. So, and this is something that tricks people a lot when you're planning to go out tide pooling, is if you don't look at the height of the low tide that you're looking at, you can go out at a low tide thinking it's the best low tide of the day, but really the morning low tide was probably the better low tide that you have to wake up early for. But these animals that live in these areas have to withstand crazy changes in their conditions every single day. So, living without water is the first thing that people think about, of course. And these animals have ways to close up and hold the water that they do have in while the tide is out. But in the summertime, they also have to deal with maybe an 80-degree hot summer day, and they're dealing with temperature changes in the air. But if it's a tide pool and they're actually in a pool of water, that water is warming up drastically. And so they have to be able to withstand those temperature changes. When water warms up, it also evaporates. So a lot of times these tide pools get extra, extra salty. And so they have to be able to withstand these salinity changes. And these are all things that might not sound that crazy, but when you consider most species have a very small range that they can survive in, if you took a fish from the open ocean and put it in a tide pool that changed 5 degrees in temperature, a lot of fish would die. A lot of fish cannot withstand changes like that. So to consider that there's hundreds of species that have adapted to living in the intertidal and deal with temperature and salinity and water changes like that constantly it's pretty wild to think about. All of these animals stay in the intertidal throughout the winter, and you also have 40-foot waves crashing all winter long, and they can somehow stay put and survive.
I was also thinking about this is still probably a pressure in the ocean in general, but I was thinking it may be even more so in tidal pools, but predators like birds, it might be easier to catch their prey in a tide pool versus in the open ocean. Is that also something that you see a lot, or?
Oh yeah, I mean seagulls and crows just like hang out on the beach waiting for low tide and then go wreak havoc on things. Yeah, they eat a lot of mussels off the rocks when it's low tide. The sea stars are relatively hard to get off the rocks, but if they can get them off a rock, a seagull will eat a sea star whole, which is kind of a crazy sight to see. But yeah, definitely predators. There's also like river otters that we sometimes see going to hunt in the tide pools.
Cool. Okay. So now moving on to the foraging side of it, which is a major part of what you do. Can you give us an introduction into what this process involves, between planning for like maybe when to go out or what tools to bring, to actually doing it, and then to making use of what you've foraged? If you want to use like a specific species as an example, like mussels or something like that, that would work as well.
Yeah, definitely. So we're really lucky in Oregon that we have a lot of different edible species that make up our coastline. So in terms of shellfish, people are generally pretty familiar with Dungeness crab that we're getting off the coast of Oregon. There's also mussels and clams that we go foraging for a lot. And with mussels and clams, you do need a low tide to be able to access them, unless you're like scuba diving, which we do have people that do that. But again, our waters are pretty murky and cold, so it's a little bit of a smaller community. So foraging at low tide, the biggest thing is obviously the tides. So it's not really like mushroom foraging where you can just sleep in and go and it's the season and you'll find them eventually. You really have to plan your excursion around the tides. So I'm typically checking tides. Well, I'm checking tides constantly because I schedule all my classes around them. But, if you have a weekend that you're going to go, you're going to want to check the tides for that weekend and the specific area that you're going. And with mussels, I'll focus on mussels. You want either scissors or a knife or maybe gloves. I sometimes just use my bare hands to rip them off, but they're relatively strong. They're stuck to the rocks, and I just have scratches all over my hands from pulling them off. So if you want gloves, it makes it a little bit easier. And the tools will help you get them off the rocks a little bit easier. I like tools like scissors or a knife to really just target, the one individual species that you're going for. A lot of times, if you see people in the rocks with like crowbars and hatchets, it's a little bit more destructive. So I try to just have a smaller impact on the area. And yeah, you harvest your species, you keep them cool. You always want to have a cooler or something with you. And then having ways to utilize the things that you're harvesting is really like another key to being sustainable, right? You don't want to harvest a bunch of stuff, realize you don't know what to do with it, and then have it all go to waste. So only harvesting what you need from an area on a given day is really, really important. And then knowing what you're going to do with it and how many people you're trying to feed. There's obviously limits on all different shellfish on how many you can harvest, and there's licenses you need to do it. But with mussels, a really easy, classic dish is just steamed mussels and garlic and butter and white wine and all the yummy things. And they're a little bit easier to me to handle than clams. Clams I love, but in Oregon, we don't really have the small steamer clams. We have bigger species of clams like gapers and cockle clams that require a little bit more cleaning. So you have to know how to purge them and how to process them and take them apart. And it's a little bit more involved, but it's all part of the process. So yeah, low tides are really the big one. Also, ocean conditions are huge outside of the tides. So I mentioned the winter storms that we get, and generally it's not the case in the winter that we have low tides that are during daylight hours. That's just it never works out that way. But if we do, it's also something to keep in mind that if we have, 30-foot waves breaking off our coast, not the best time to go to the rocks. Generally, the tide won't be very low, even if it is supposed to be a low tide if there's waves that big, because it's constantly pushing water to shore, but it's not something to risk either.
Are there like specific seasons for specific things that you forage, or do they mostly overlap with each other?
Yeah, in general, the regulation for shellfish is that with a recreational license, you can harvest them year round. So mussels and clams and crabs in the bay, you can harvest year round. We do have I say we have seasons based on the tides. So again, the tides in the winter don't often line up to be during the day, and the weather conditions make it kind of rare to be able to get out there. So my foraging personally is also kind of on pause in the wintertime, as is my workshop season. But with seaweeds, it's a little bit different. Seaweed is regulated by a different party. It's by the Department of State Lands. And you don't need a license, but there's still limits on how much you can take. And there is a specific season to only harvesting seaweed from March to mid-June. So seasons definitely in terms of environmental factors. And then sometimes shellfish gets closed in summer months, depending on harmful algae blooms or other things that go on.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the sustainability of foraging and kind of limiting your negative impact on the environment, but do you have anything else to add to that whole idea?
Yeah, sustainability around foraging is huge, right? And in Oregon, we have, and kind of all over the place, we do have areas that are protected and that are off limits to foraging. And that's really important to keep in mind. And another thing to check when you're looking at where you're going to go foraging, there are places where you cannot do it at all. And I think it's a huge point to make that foraging to me is a way that people can really be connected to the place that they are and to where their food is coming from. And it is, we have limits on how much shellfish you can harvest all of these things are based off of research and studies that scientists have done on our ecosystems. And in Oregon, for example, per person per day, you can harvest 72 mussels, which is a lot of mussels. And if you are ever in our rocky ecosystems, you see why you can harvest that many mussels, because there are hundreds of thousands of mussels. We're not losing our mussel beds quite yet. That being said, harvesting mussels in a sustainable way in your backyard in a place that has a lot of mussels could potentially be more sustainable than buying unsustainable fish from the grocery store that isn't from here, right? So there's balances to all of it. I think foraging can be really sustainable and there's ways to do it very sustainably, but that's also not to say that our planet can't necessarily survive with every single person foraging from every single ecosystem. So we need limits on it, which we have, and we need regulation and kind of monitoring of how it's done, but definitely something to learn is the sustainability behind what you're foraging.
Yeah. I didn't do too much looking into this part of your background, but I was curious also about your experience with seaweed farming and how that might tie into this conversation of having sustainable sources of resources from the ocean. Can you kind of talk about that a little more, or if you want to?
Yeah, I could talk about seaweed for days. Um, Seaweed farming, it is honestly kind of what got me more involved in food systems work and got me more involved in the sustainability of seafood and kind of focusing on education around that topic. So I started farming seaweed three or 4 years ago now with Oregon Seaweed in Garibaldi. And we're a land-based Pacific dulse farm. So we pump water into tanks, it circulates through the tanks, and Pacific dulse is growing. And seaweed farming is an industry that's picking up more and more in the US. It is a really sustainable and really nutritious food source. So, in terms of feeding more people on a planet with a growing population, we need new avenues for food, and aquaculture and mariculture are a huge potential for this. So, seaweed farming is ramping up, and when I started working there, I yeah, not only was helping farm seaweed, but the biggest hiccup is kind of what do you do with the seaweed once you have it? And how do we educate consumers on how to use this and get it on more restaurant menus? And seaweed is not something that's so big in our cultural diets, right? Well, maybe not every American, but that was kind of the biggest question I for so long was like, how did I become a seaweed salesperson? But realized it's all education. It's all teaching people how to use this product that is really good for you and has potential to do really well in the environment. So that is definitely what set me on the track of figuring out what that even is, how getting food from the ocean to your plate happens and every step involved in that process, and realizing that yeah, our food has the potential to input a lot of carbon into our environment, and what is the carbon footprint of the food that we're sourcing and how does it affect the environment. So yeah, so my background with seaweed is really only this past 3 or 4 years, but it has inspired a lot of what I do, and it has also now created this obsession with the seaweed industry and with wild seaweeds, and I think it's just such an underutilized and underappreciated food source and resource on our coast that I love opening people's eyes to.
It's interesting that you mentioned kind of like a seaweed obsession, because when I was talking to Matt from one of the previous episodes of Shellphone that I mentioned to you earlier, he kind of described the same thing. He and like his group of friends are all like seaweed enthusiasts, and it does seem like a really niche thing of in the way that what do you do with seaweed, but it seems like it's growing a lot.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it's funny because a lot of times, like most people are dealing with seaweed in their daily lives, they just don't realize it. So a lot of things on any processed food shelf have either agar-agar or carrageenan in them, and those are both products of seaweed. So I used to work with kids a lot and asking kids about eating seaweed if their reaction was ever ew, I would hold up gushers and fruit roll-ups and all of these candies that have carrageenan in them and explain to them that they are always eating some component of seaweed. They just don't know.
That is so true. I didn't even think about that. I guess keeping with the topic of seaweed, I also wanted to ask you about the kind of art programs that you mentioned, like making cyanotypes with seaweed. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what cyanotype is and how that process works?
Yeah, so these were really fun ways to get other people involved in conversations around seaweed and just introduce people to the abundance of seaweed on the Oregon coast. But I partnered with a friend of mine who's a professional printmaker and woodworker, and he makes cyanotypes out of portraits that he takes. But a cyanotype, if you aren't familiar, is essentially it's where the term blueprint came from. So if you've ever seen these blueprint images they've often been done with botanical specimens, but it's a UV reactive process that you use these two chemicals, you mix them together, you paint it onto paper, and it gets exposed in UV light. So you ideally prep this paper not in UV light, so in a dark garage or somewhere, and when you expose it to the light, if you put something on top of it, it leaves a white print of whatever you put on top of it. So the first cyanotype book was actually made using seaweed specimens. So it's always a fun connection to talk about the creation of cyanotypes and using seaweeds in our workshops. But we host these workshops with a collection of dried and pressed seaweeds that I've collected for years and years and had sitting in a box and not knowing what to do with them. Yeah, so we bring all the pressed seaweeds to the workshop and we prepare paper prior to the class, and then everybody gets to make their own little cyanotype print that they get to take home with them. So it's kind of a scientific process to make because your UV light is always changing depending on the conditions that you're working in and if a cloud covers the sun and all sorts of different things. So it's really fun just working with the environment that you're outside in and making little seaweed arts.
At the Discovery Center where I work, they did kind of a craft day last year, and one of the crafts that they did that they had for kids to do was doing that. And it was kind of unfortunate because some of them, it wasn't really the right conditions that day, so some of them didn't come out the best. But I still think it was a really fun process for the kids to see. And when it does come out, they look really cool.
Yeah, it's always funny. We do a lot of these in the wintertime, and we have like one, our UV rating is like 1 in Oregon. And we've done them in the rain on like the grayest days ever, and they work. You just have to be really patient. So it's always a matter of like, okay, leave your print outside in the rain for 10 minutes and go and check on it. But when it's a nice sunny day in the summer, it's like a 30-second process.
Yeah, that was probably also part of it. The kids had kind of like limited time. It was kind of just however long they happened to have when they came across the center. This goes back a little bit to the foraging, but I was curious if you had like a favorite. I don't know if you do a lot of cooking on your own time, but I was curious if you had a favorite dish that you like to make with foraged ingredients.
Yeah, no, I definitely do a lot of cooking. It's like half the fun of foraging, I think. And I do cooking demonstrations when I take people foraging. So if we're harvesting mussels, we do a quick steam of the mussels on the beach so that you can get an idea of really how easy it is to do, but so that you feel confident when you go home with your shellfish. And I think it depends on what I'm foraging, but with mussels, I love coconut curry mussels is super, super good. We have a number of clams on the Oregon coast, and I really like any type of clam ceviche, but it's nice because you can kind of put it into the clamshell and then eat your ceviche out of a clamshell. And with seaweeds, we have a lot of kelps here that get really big, and one of them is a kelp called Alaria. And I really like taking it and wrapping fish in it and then baking that so that you kind of have this little like parcel that is fish with all your butter and garlic, but it's wrapped in a little bundle of kelp. So lots of different ways to prepare different seafoods.
In the same vein, do you have a favorite animal to come across when you're out on the coast?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. I love nudibranchs. So nudibranchs are little sea slugs we get them pretty often, and sometimes they're really, really abundant. In the spring, we have like hundreds of them crawling around the tide pools, but they're really small, so they're relatively hard to find. And if you don't know to look for them, you probably won't ever see them. And if you do know to look for them, you're kind of always constantly looking for them because everybody wants to see them. They're really beautiful. So nudibranchs are my favorite thing to show people fairly often. Of course, finding an octopus in a tide pool is like the dream come true, but it doesn't happen that often. I've probably seen 5 in my 10 years of living here. So it's always a more rare occurrence and something that you just stumble upon, but that's a fun one as well.
That also reminded me that I wanted to ask for anyone who wants to go out and experience this on their own, like foraging, looking at tide pools, any of that. Are there any like major tips or best practices that you would suggest for people, like for their own safety, for their impact on the environment, or what to keep an eye out for that they might not think to?
Yeah, I think ocean conditions are a huge one for me, especially on the Oregon coast where we have really crazy storms and crazy tides. It's definitely whether if you know that there's a low tide, I think knowing what the ocean is doing outside of the tides is really important. So, especially if you're coming from far, I often tell people if it's the winter, like look at a surf report as well as what the tide charts are doing. Because even if you have a negative tide, if you look at a surf report and it says there's 30-foot waves breaking, please don't do it. It's not worth it. We have a lot of accidents that happen on the Oregon coast every year, and they seem very avoidable. So I try to help people avoid that. The other thing to keep in mind is that, yeah, you have an impact when we're exploring any of these ecosystems. So if you're tide pooling, trying not to walk on top of the rocks that are covered in living animals and staying on the sand and just being aware of where your feet are and what you could potentially be damaging is also really important. And then with foraging, of course, knowing the regulations of where you are and the impact of what you're doing is really, really important. So especially with things like seaweeds that have really specific reproductive life strategies, knowing what on a seaweed maybe is that reproductive component or when they're actually reproducing and things like that is really good to know when you're going, and then sticking with within your state or your country's regulations. Their regulations change state by state. So everything that I do is based in Oregon, but I'm an hour from the Washington border. And if I go up there, there's completely different rules and regulations to follow.
Great. Well, those are all of the questions that I have. Is there anything else that you'd like to make sure we talk about, or any final points that you'd like to put in?
No, I encourage people to get out into their environment and try new foods. If you aren't familiar with eating seaweeds, we host a culinary series in Oregon in the month of February called Winter Waters that is focused around seaweed and all local seafare. So it's a big celebration throughout the month with a lot of different partners and events going on. But it's something that we do every year in February. So definitely something to keep an eye on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today. Super interesting to learn about, so I'm glad we got to.
Sweet. Thanks so much, Harmony.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thanks for tuning into Shellphone. To learn more about our projects, suggest a guest, or donate to the show, visit our website at breachthesurface.org or social media at breachthesurface and at Shellphone Podcast. You can find Alanna on Instagram at shifting_tides_NW or at her website, which is shiftingtidesnw.com, where you can sign up for her newsletter for up-to-date information.